women and little children so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death. Levi Savage.
The emigrants were entirely ignorant of the country and climate. Simple, honest, eager to go to Zion at once. John Chislett, Willie Company.
A few leaders were still hesitant to continue the journey. About 100 people chose to stay behind in Nebraska.
They knew that they were late. Everybody knew that they were late. Richards frankly admitted that he anticipated that they would have some snow.
From the outset, clear back in 1847, it was very clearly stated that they must get an early start. Early enough so they could get all the way across during the summer months. This was the cardinal guideline. And unfortunately, it was ignored.
Company leaders determined to push on, trusting a divine hand would temper the elements and shore up the travelers.
Seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in His mercy bless and preserve us. Levi Savage, Willie Company.
Something in their soul kept them coming. Even though all common sense would say, hey, just stop here. And they didn't.
Saturday, August 26th. We started with our handcart this morning. James Blake, Martin Company.
Each person was allotted 17 pounds of personal belongings. A handful of wagons carrying supplies and tents trailed behind the carts. In addition, 385 immigrants who could afford teams traveled behind the Martin Company in either the 33 wagons with W.B. Hodgett or the 50 wagons with John A. Hunt.
Soon the monotony and rigor of the trail wore down the emigrants.
We continued our toil day after day, pulling our handcarts with our provisions or rations, our little children, etc., through deep sands, rocky roads, or fording streams. It was a dreary journey. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
The carts broke down as the unseasoned lumber dried out and shrank. Sand and rocks ground down the wheels and axles. Repairs caused further delays. Their troubles worsened when on the night of September 3rd, a violent thunderstorm and a buffalo stampede scattered their cattle. The loss of the Willie Company's livestock signaled disaster.
We hunted for our livestock 3 days in every direction, but did not find them. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Through losing our cattle and having to camp on the plains for several weeks, it threw us late in the season and made our provisions short for the latter part of our journey. Susanna Stone, Willie Company.
Willie, fully aware that they were running out of time, said that they would go on. But they were definitely hampered by not having these animals. They had to hitch heifers and milk cows to their wagons just to keep moving. Their progress was slowed by at least a third, maybe almost in half. Now the Martin Company, when they left Florence, it was late enough in the year that, in my opinion, they were doomed from the beginning.
September 8th. We travelled 18 miles over a very heavy road. No water in place. James Blake, Martin Company.
Traveling fast in light wagons, immigration agent Franklin D. Richards and about a dozen returning missionaries passed the Martin and Willie companies on the trail. Richards promised to send food and supplies from Salt Lake as soon as he arrived. By early September, the emigrants were beginning to run out of food.
On September 30, we arrived at Fort Laramie, having necessarily expended considerable time in the repair of handcarts. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Due to the lateness of the season, Fort Laramie's shelves were bare of food supplies except for a couple of barrels of crackers and a bit of bacon.
October 8th. Our old people are nearly all failing fast. Levi Savage, Willie Company.
Shortly after leaving Fort Laramie, it became necessary to shorten our rations that they might hold out and that the company be not reduced to starvation. The reduction was repeated several times. We pushed ahead. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
It was ascertained that at our present rate of travel and consumption of flour, the latter would be exhausted when we were about 350 miles from our destination. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Those who knew the trail could not ignore the heavy frost on the ground each morning. They were cold, hungry, and utterly exhausted from pulling the carts and taking their turn at guard duty. No relief was in sight.
The mountains before us revealed themselves to view, mantled nearly to their base in snow, and tokens of a coming storm were discernible in the clouds, which each day seemed to lower around us. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Strips of burlap or canvas replaced worn-out shoes. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Their ragged clothing, wet from river crossings, never dried one day to the next.
October 14th. Some would sit down by the roadside and die. My younger sister Caroline, 17 years old, after travelling all day, took off her apron to tie some sagebrush in. They found her chilled and dying and carried her into camp. She was placed in an unmarked grave. Robert Reeder, Willie Company.
October 16th. Our rations of flour was reduced from 1 pound to 12 ounces for adults and 8 ounces for my children to 6 ounces a day. James Blake, Martin Company.
There was not enough food to maintain the body heat they required. There was not enough bedding or clothing to keep them warm, particularly at night. They became exhausted, and this brought them down.
October 17th. Good blankets and other bedding and clothing were burned as they could not be carried further. There was yet 400 miles of winter to go through. John Jakes, Martin Company.
They had to lighten their loads to take this load off their men to give them a better chance of surviving, because it was mostly the men that were dying. So the loads were lightened, and everything that wasn't absolutely essential was burned. Even some essential things were burned, bedding and warm clothing, but just because they couldn't carry it anymore.
October 18th, fourth crossing of the Sweetwater. The air is cool. Levi Savage, Willie Company.
October 19th. We crossed the Platte, very trying in consequence of its width and the cold weather. James Blake, Martin Company.
Men, women and children waded through the current, many needing assistance. And then the snow, hail and wind came.
We were overtaken by a snowstorm, which the shrill wind blew furiously about us. The snow fell several inches deep as we travelled along, but we dared not stop. John Chislett, Willie Company.
Winter came all at once, and that was the first day of it. John Jakes, Martin Company.
The weather hit then. The sleet, the snow. They were already wet from the crossing. The wetness froze on their bodies, which is the worst thing that can happen in cold weather, is to be wet. And so that very first night we have a large number of deaths, but we don't know. We have some people saying that there were 14 the night after they had crossed.
We had to travel in our wet clothes until we got to camp. Our clothing was nearly frozen on us. That night the ground was frozen so hard we were unable to drive any tent pins in, and the tent was wet. We stretched the tent open and got under it until morning. Patience Loader, Martin Company. I listened to hear my husband breathe. He lay so still. Put my hand on his body, when to my horror I discovered that my worst fears were confirmed. He was cold and stiff, rigid in the arms of death. Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson, Martin Company.
It was just cold. And cold can kill you.